Hello everyone. Today we will learn about the abdominal muscles. The abdominal muscles are located between the thoracic cage and the pelvis. They participate in forming the abdominal wall. According to their location, they can be divided into two parts, the anterolateral group and the posterior group. Anterolateral group. The anterolateral group forms the anterolateral wall of the abdominal cavity. It includes the strap-like rectus abdominis muscle and three broad flat muscles. These are the external oblique, internal oblique, and transversus abdominis muscles. First, let's look at the external oblique muscle. The external oblique is a broad, flat muscle. It is located superficially in the anterolateral abdominal region. It originates by 8 muscular slips from the external surfaces of the lower 8 ribs. Its slips interdigitate with those of the serratus anterior and latissimus dorsi muscles. Its muscle fibers run obliquely in an infero-anterior direction. The posterior bundles course inferiorly. They insert into the anterior part of the iliac crest. The remaining muscle bundles continue medially as an aponeurosis. The aponeurosis passes anterior to the rectus abdominis muscle. It participates in forming the anterior layer of the rectus sheath. At the midline of the abdomen, it ends in the linea alba. The inferior border of the external oblique aponeurosis is folded and thickened, extending between the anterior superior iliac spine and the pubic tubercle. This is called the inguinal ligament. At the medial end of the inguinal ligament, a small band of tendinous fibers reflects postero-inferiorly to the pecten pubis. This is called the lacunar ligament. It is also known as the Gimbernat's ligament. The part of the lacunar ligament extending and attaching to the pecten pubis is called the pectineal ligament or Cooper's ligament. The inguinal ligament and the pectineal ligament are both important structures used during inguinal hernia repair to reinforce the wall of the inguinal canal, superolateral to the pubic tubercle. The aponeurosis forms a triangular opening called the superficial inguinal ring. It is also known as the external ring. Next, the internal oblique muscle lies deep to the external oblique muscle. It originates from the thoracolumbar fascia, the iliac crest, and the lateral half of the inguinal ligament. Its muscle bundles fan out. The posterior bundles ascend almost vertically to insert into the inferior 3 ribs. Most of the muscle bundles continue anterosuperiorly as an aponeurosis. At the lateral border of the rectus abdominis, it splits into anterior and posterior layers. These layers envelop the rectus abdominis muscle, participating in the formation of the anterior and posterior layers of the rectus sheath. They end in the linea alba at the midline. The inferior muscle bundles of the internal oblique, originating from the inguinal ligament, run antero-inferiorly, pass anterior to the spermatic cord, and become aponeurotic. They unite with the aponeurotic fibers of the transversus abdominis muscle to form the falx inguinalis conjoint tendon. This is also called the conjoint tendon. It inserts near the medial end of the pecten pubis and pubic tubercle. The lowest part of the internal oblique muscle gives off some fine, scattered muscle fibers that surround the spermatic cord, testis, and scrotum. This is called the cremaster muscle. Its contraction elevates the testis. Although it is a skeletal muscle, it is not under voluntary control. In females, this muscle is very rudimentary. Only a few fibers descend along the surface of the round ligament of the uterus, corresponding to the lateral part of the cremaster muscle in males. 2. The transversus abdominis muscle lies deep to the internal oblique muscle. It originates from the internal surfaces of the lower 6 costal cartilages, the thoracolumbar fascia, the iliac crest, and the lateral third of the inguinal ligament. Its muscle bundles run transversely forward and become an aponeurosis. The aponeurosis passes posterior to the rectus abdominis, participates in forming the posterior layer of the rectus sheath, and ends in the linea alba. The lowest muscle bundles of the transversus abdominis and the medial part of the inferior border of its aponeurosis participate in the formation of the cremaster muscle and the conjoint tendon, respectively. The rectus abdominis muscle is located on either side of the midline of the anterior abdominal wall. It lies within the rectus sheath. It is broader superiorly and narrower inferiorly. It originates from the pubic symphysis and the pubic crest. Its muscle bundles ascend to insert into the xiphoid process of the sternum and the anterior aspects of the costal cartilages of the 5th to 7th ribs. The entire length of the muscle is intersected by 3 or 4 transverse tendinous intersections, dividing it into several muscle bellies. The tendinous intersections are composed of connective tissue. They are firmly adherent to the anterior layer of the rectus sheath. They represent the traces of fused myotomes. On the posterior surface of the rectus abdominis, the tendinous intersections are not distinct. They are not fused with the posterior layer of the rectus sheath. Therefore, the posterior surface of the rectus abdominis is completely free. The function of the anterolateral muscle group. The fibers of the 3 flat muscles interlace with each other, forming a structure like plywood, thin yet tough. Together with the rectus abdominis, they form a strong and elastic abdominal wall that protects the abdominal viscera. They maintain intra-abdominal pressure. Intra-abdominal pressure is crucial for stabilizing the position of the abdominal organs. If the tone of these muscles weakens, it can lead to ptosis, drooping, of the abdominal organs. When the abdominal muscles contract, they can increase intra-abdominal pressure to facilitate physiological functions such as defecation, childbirth, vomiting, and coughing. They can flex, laterally flex, and rotate the vertebral column. They can also depress the ribs, assisting in expiration. The rectus sheath encloses the rectus abdominis muscle. It is formed by the aponeuroses of the 3 flat muscles of the anterolateral abdominal wall. The sheath has an anterior and a posterior layer. The anterior layer is formed by the aponeurosis of the external oblique and the anterior layer of the aponeurosis of the internal oblique. The posterior layer is formed by the posterior layer of the aponeurosis of the internal oblique and the aponeurosis of the transversus abdominis. At a point about 4 to 5 centimeters below the umbilicus, the aponeuroses of all 3 flat muscles pass anterior to the rectus abdominis to form the anterior layer of the rectus sheath. This results in the absence of a posterior layer. Therefore, the posterior layer of the rectus sheath ends in a curved line with a concave inferior edge, due to the interruption of the aponeuroses. This is called the arcuate line or semicircular line. Below this line, the posterior surface of the rectus abdominis is in contact with the transversalis fascia. The linea alba is located in the midline of the anterior abdominal wall. It is a fibrous band between the right and left rectus sheath. It is formed by the interweaving of fibers from the aponeuroses of the 3 flat muscles from both sides. It extends superiorly from the xiphoid process to the pubic symphysis inferiorly. The linea alba is tough and relatively avascular. Its superior part is wider, about 1 centimeter, and it narrows inferior to the umbilicus, becoming linear. Approximately at its midpoint, there is an area of loose scar tissue called the umbilical ring. In the fetus, the umbilical vessels pass through this ring. It is a weak point in the abdominal wall. If abdominal contents protrude through it, it is called an umbilical hernia. Next, let's look at the posterior group of abdominal muscles. The posterior group consists of the psoas major and the quadratus lumborum muscles. The psoas major will be discussed with the lower limb. First, let's examine the quadratus lumborum muscle. The quadratus lumborum is located in the posterior abdominal wall. It lies lateral to the vertebral column. The psoas major muscle is medial to it. The erector spinae muscle is posterior to it. The quadratus lumborum is enclosed between the deep and middle layers of the thoracolumbar fascia, which separates it from other muscles. It originates from the posterior part of the iliac crest and inserts superiorly into the 12th rib and the transverse processes of the 1st to 4th lumbar vertebrae. Its action is to depress and stabilize the 12th rib and to laterally flex the vertebral column. Now, let's look at an important structure, the inguinal canal. The canal is located just above the medial half of the inguinal ligament and runs obliquely from superolateral to infromedial. It is about 4 to 5 centimeters long. The internal opening of the canal is called the deep inguinal ring. It is an outpouching of the transversalis fascia located about 1.5 centimeters above the midpoint of the inguinal ligament. The inferior epigastric artery is located medial to it. The external opening of the canal is the superficial inguinal ring. The canal has 4 walls. The anterior wall is formed by the aponeurosis of the external oblique and the internal oblique muscle. The posterior wall is formed by the transversalis fascia and the conjoint tendon. The superior wall is formed by the arching lower fibers of the internal oblique and transversus abdominis muscles. The floor is formed by the inguinal ligament. In males, the inguinal canal contains the spermatic cord. In females, it contains the round ligament of the uterus. Next, let's examine another important anatomical structure, the inguinal triangle, also known as Hasselbalch's triangle. It is located in the lower part of the anterior abdominal wall. It is bounded by the lateral border of the rectus abdominis muscle, the inguinal ligament, and the inferior epigastric artery. Both the inguinal canal and the inguinal triangle are potential weak areas in the lower abdominal wall. Under pathological conditions, such as failure of the processus vaginalis to close, weak abdominal muscle, or chronic increased intra-abdominal pressure, abdominal contents can protrude through these areas, forming a hernia. If abdominal contents pass through the deep inguinal ring, into the inguinal canal, and then through the superficial inguinal ring, descending into the scrotum, it constitutes an indirect inguinal hernia. If abdominal contents bulge directly through the inguinal triangle without passing through the deep ring, it is a direct inguinal hernia. If abdominal contents bulge directly through the inguinal triangle without passing through the deep ring, it is a direct inguinal hernia. During surgery, care must be taken to protect the ilioepigastric and ilioinguinal nerves. The former pierces the internal oblique muscle about 2.5 centimeters anterior to the anterior superior iliac spine, runs deep to the external oblique aponeurosis, and emerges superficial to the superficial inguinal ring. The latter runs inferior to the former, passes superficial to the spermatic cord, and exits through the superficial inguinal ring. Both nerves supply the deep muscles of this region. Intraoperative injury to the ilioepigastric and ilioinguinal nerves can lead to recurrence of the hernia.